Last week, Dallin H. Oaks, the president of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, appointed a new apostle to replace Jeffrey R. Holland in the Quorum of the 12. I did a video a few weeks ago about apostolic appointments in general and talking about the politics leading up to this appointment. And one of the 4 possibilities that I highlighted ended up being correct. Clark Gilbert, most recently the Commissioner of Education, is the new apostle at the age of 55. Though I must admit that while I mentioned Gilbert as a possibility, I did not think that he was the most likely candidate for reasons that I'll get into. Now, every apostolic appointment turns out to be consequential. Apostles serve lifelong callings in the second highest priesthood quorum for the rest of their lives, and they will have a hand in nearly every significant decision, policy, and push for the next few decades. And if they outlive everyone ahead of them in the line of seniority, everyone that's been appointed an apostle before this moment, they'll then become president of the church through the right of succession. And given that Gilbert is the youngest man to be called as an apostle since David A. Bednar several decades ago, it's quite likely that he will have a long tenure and has a high likelihood of serving as president. Now, in many ways, Gilbert fits a common background for apostles. He has lots of higher education, impressive credentials, in this case in business, which is one of the common backgrounds that apostles are called from today, given the modern global bureaucracy that the LDS Church has become. And he's also served as president of one of the BYU campuses, BYU-Idaho, before serving as Commissioner of Education. All of those are common backgrounds you'll find in many, including Dallin H. Oaks, who served as president of BYU, and Jeffrey R. Holland, who he is replacing, who served both as president of BYU and Commissioner of Education. But this choice seems particularly consequential for several reasons. Gilbert has a very prominent name and reputation in the last few years. He's also developed a sense of identity with his rhetoric and activities that I'll get into later. And his pick likely reflects the direction that Dallin H. Oaks as president is wishing to push the church toward in today's context. It also demonstrates, I argue, the continued significance placed on religious education as a crucial point of attention, given Gilbert's background in that realm, which he's now bringing to the Quorum of the 12. So in this video, I hope to do a few things. First, I hope to provide some background and biographical details for Clark Gilbert, especially highlighting some significant early moments that I think are crucial for understanding his overall vision and approach. Then I'm going to talk about how he developed a particular reputation as a cultural warrior, pushing orthodoxy during his time as the Commissioner of Education. And then I want to explore how his ideas fit into a much longer historical trajectory of LDS fears concerning assimilation and retrenchment, as well as how those ideas fit into the broader culture. Now, notably, I want to preface my remarks here with a few things. I certainly have my own private opinions. I've heard plenty of private stories and have my own personal experiences with Gilbert, but I'm going to keep this discussion to the public record. And more, I want to provide a scholarly overview of the current era as seen through the tensions related to Gilbert's time as a church leader. I recognize that LDS apostles are viewed in a certain way within the LDS context and that their callings are understood to be guided by revelation. My academic analysis is not meant to disrespect that at all. Instead, I'm trying to provide an academic analysis based on my discipline and scholarly field. And my hope is that I can provide an overview and background that both Latter-day Saints, believing or not, as well as Clark Gilbert himself, might at least feel is fair. So with that all out of the way, let's dig into the history. Clark Gilbert was born in Oakland, raised in Arizona, and served his mission to Kobe, Japan. His origin stories that he's spoken of in numerous occasions often emphasize that from an early age, he saw no division between his education and his faith, and indeed he believed that faith and education should be interwoven together, a key theme that we're going to see throughout his life and his ideas. He received a bachelor's degree in international relations from Brigham Young University, where he served in the student government with none other than Mike Lee. Here you see an early photograph of those two soon-to-be prominent figures. He then received a master's degree in East Asian Studies from Stanford University, before receiving his doctorate in business from Harvard Business School. He then taught at Harvard Business School for a short period of time. He was not retained long term. But while his period at Harvard was short, I think is quite influential. And this is one of the first major points that I want to emphasize, is that Clark Gilbert was part of what was called the Disruption School of Business Innovation, led by prominent LDS business professionals like Kim Clark, who later becomes president of BYU-Idaho, and Clayton Christensen, one of the most prominent Mormon business professors in history. This theory of disruption is often focused on how businesses fail. Often because, according to this theory, they are not nimble enough to adapt to new contemporary contexts. They argued that for innovation to thrive, the walls of inefficiency must be torn down. You have to be disruptive and ruthless to adapt, to match the growing concerns and what they define as a public interest. That business analytics should be incorporated in order to better meet the bottom line, streamline your message, and meet the public demand. Again, what they call the public interest. Now, a little over a decade ago, the Harvard historian Jill Lepore analyzed the growth of this disruptions theory in a 2014 New Yorker essay. Here you see an image that I recommend going to check out. It's wonderfully written and a good engagement with the topic. She explored how disruption theory was born at Harvard Business School, identifying figures like Clayton Christensen and Henry Eyring, for just recently the president of BYU-Idaho, and how those ideas have since spread out of business schools into other arenas. And I want to read a quote from that story that I think is quite revealing and important to understand as an origins for Clark Gilbert. Quote, "Innovation and disruption are ideas that originate in the arena of business, but which have since been applied to arenas whose values and goals are remote from the values and goals of business. People aren't disk drives. Public schools, colleges and universities, churches, museums, and many hospitals, all of which have been subjected to disruptive innovation, have revenues and expenses and infrastructures, but they aren't industries in the same way that manufacturers of hard disk drives or truck engines or dry goods are industries. Journalism isn't an industry in that sense either." Close quote. I highlight this quote from Jill Lepore's analysis, which again I recommend. You can find a link in the video description, because it shows this conflicting vision of disciplines, that Clark Gilbert is coming from one particular disciplinary background that's going to have its own sets of assumptions and agendas that is going to come in conflict in these other arenas. Now, the disruption school proponents would probably argue that that disruption is necessary, and just because it conflicts with these other standards doesn't mean it's wrong, but there needs to be an adaptation and perhaps a reconciliation. Now, after his short time at Harvard, according to Clark Gilbert's own narrative, he had offers to go to other academic institutions, but instead chose to go into church administration, first at Brigham Young University, Idaho, but then he was pulled in 2009 to become president and CEO of Deseret Digital Media, a new position that oversaw a lot of the media organizations under the church, and then the next year, he was appointed president of Deseret News, their newspaper. This is where he was able to implement his disruption theory in the journalistic arena, which was a topic of a lot of his written scholarship. And we see a lot of those theories play out. Within his first year, he slashed the newspaper staff by 40%, declaring that that sizable number was inefficient and was not able to meet the productive goals of a money-making newspaper. He emphasized the need for the newspaper to find their niche, to find their public interests, and rely more on voluntary labor and the participation of those within the community. He also argued that the newspaper should be focused on a centralized message. Before this time, Deseret News was known for its mostly non-partisan and neutral analysis, and many outside observers would often express surprise at how neutral the Deseret News was, even on topics that were of importance to the LDS Church. But Clark Gilbert argued that because of the financial ties to the church, and because of the community that Deseret News is helping to cultivate, they should focus on those ideas that are most important to the LDS Church. He identified 6 key themes: family, financial responsibility, excellence in education, care for the needy, values in media, and faith in the community. He argued that the Deseret News should be focused on supplementing and defending the church, and as a result, the newspaper became much more profitable and became what it is today, with a very clear agenda and argument for what it's trying to do. Then, due to the success of his time at Deseret Media, he was appointed president of BYU-Idaho in 2015, and then after just 2 years, he was the founding president of the Pathway program. And I want to take a second and note that the Pathway program, which is trying to provide education worldwide, especially to communities and individuals who might not have access to education, is a wonderful and noble enterprise. And while there are criticisms about the way it does that and how it understands academic credentials to be taught in these classes and the standards and the rigor, I want to set all those criticisms aside because I truly think that the Pathway program is one of these great examples of how the disruption theory can actually work and do a lot of good. The public interest, in other words, is genuinely being served by that. And then finally, in 2021, Clark Gilbert was named a general authority, and then a few months later, in August of 2021, he was appointed Commissioner of Education. Before I go much further, I need to do my awkward but necessary pitch for this channel. If you enjoy this type of nerdy context that tries to provide historical background for our current moment, please make sure you're subscribed to this channel. I do deep dives on topics every Monday like this one. On Wednesdays, I connect the past to the present. And on Fridays, I pull back the curtain on the historian's craft. And if you want to give back to enable both me and my wonderful producer, Anthony, to devote our time to these videos, you can become a member of the channel, where for a very small nominal fee, you get early access to the videos, you get little icons next to your name, and most importantly, you know you're allowing this channel to thrive, as far as thriving can be an operative word with someone like me. Please mark your calendar for this Wednesday, February 18th at 2 p.m. Mountain Time. I'm doing a live discussion with the wonderful essayist and humorist Eli McCann. It will be here on this YouTube channel, where we are talking about his new book of essays from Signature Books. We are thankful for the moisture. It's a phenomenal volume, and I can't wait to dig in, so make sure to join us then. I also recommend subscribing to my Kit newsletter, a free newsletter where I send out every other week or so updates on what I've done on various platforms, news, analysis, a variety of things. And again, it's free. And make sure that when you subscribe to it, you confirm your subscription, because that confirmation email typically goes to your junk mail. And then you can also follow me on a variety of social media platforms, TikTok, Facebook, Instagram, where I do shorter form content, often supplementing what I do on this channel. All right, enough with that business stuff. Let's get back to Gilbert. You likely remember back in August of 2021 when Jeffrey R. Holland, then an apostle, spoke before the BYU gathering of faculty and delivered what came to be known as his musket fire address. The theme of his remarks was that the school had been slightly veering away from its original purpose, especially on cases related to gender and sexuality. And Holland cited a famous, if a bit folkloric, statement about Nauvoo Temple, where Latter-day Saints will go to bed with a shovel in one hand and a musket in another to be able to defend the church against its enemies, and saying, "I wish I heard more musket fire from this Temple of Higher Learning of BYU." Notably, during that infamous speech, the musket fire speech, Holland also introduced Clark Gilbert as the new Commissioner of Church Education. Gilbert, who was appointed general authority just a few months prior, was now in charge of the church's education. And it seems quite clear that that same message that Jeffrey R. Holland gave to BYU faculty at that time, that we need to return to values, was also probably the message and the agenda given to Clark Gilbert to do as Commissioner of Education. And the results of what Clark Gilbert did to try to reaffirm that orthodox core can be seen in a detailed and substantial Salt Lake Tribune analysis of a few years later. It came out in early 2024 by the legendary Salt Lake Tribune journalist Peggy Fletcher Stack, titled "Dark Days at BYU." Now, I know this story and all the elements can be a bit divisive, but I think it's fair to say that Clark Gilbert and his supporters argue that that was a success, whereas others would see it as a shortcoming or at least controversial within the BYU context. Within the first year of taking office, on the heels of that musket fire inspire agenda-setting speech, Clark Gilbert gave a presentation to a number of prominent Latter-day Saints in Salt Lake City, in which he explained that he did a formal study of BYU faculty and grouped them into 4 categories. Here are the 4 categories taken from the Salt Lake Tribune story. There are some who are the faithful core, those that teach with the Holy Spirit and weave in church tenets as they understand them. There's the supportive center. They support the church, but are not as enthusiastic as church leaders as they ought to be, and apparently this was the largest group, according to him. There's the secular first. They put the truth from any source on equal footing with the Latter-day Saint gospel, and open foes. They write an article or take a public position contrary to that of the church. And to back up these policies, to try to weed out those in the bad categories and try to push everyone to the good categories, there were several policies that Clark Gilbert introduced. In 2022, he installed a new loyalty oath for professors to pledge their support for the church's stance, especially on marriage, family, and gender. This new pledge was required for new hires, and it was encouraged for all faculty to opt in. This went beyond traditional questions concerning belief and action. It asked questions like, do these candidates support church doctrine on marriage, family, and gender? Do they say anything that would lead others to doubt the doctrine or teachings? And have they used pornography during the past few years? It also required faculty to always have a temple recommend, not just have their ecclesiastical endorsement, which had been the requirement for some time before. And to enforce these new measures, Gilbert introduced a new Ecclesiastical Clearance Office, the ECO, which would give final say over prospective hires, as well as renewals. And there are stories of many potential candidates who were not hired, likely because, although there was never a reason given, that in Gilbert's words, they were not mission aligned, that there was a desire to make sure that all faculty were sticking to the orthodoxy and the traditional values. And there were several instances in which probationary faculty were not renewed based on the alleged participation in subversive activities like support for LGBTQ rights inclusion. And we see that directly implied in LGBTQ activities and groups on BYU campus. They no longer had access to marching at the Y on Pride Month, the year after the Y was lit up in rainbow colors. He stopped the Department of Communication Disorders Voice and Communication Services, which had been used by some to train trans students, and it curtailed student LGBTQ groups and dialogues. You also see a lot of these fundamental ideas merged into the new Becoming BYU initiative, which included a required course for all freshmen that was similar to a lot of university 101 courses found across the nation, but also involved teaching what is the primary values and historical exceptional idea of BYU. Gilbert and his defenders believe that these are laudatory and important steps to reaffirm the church's control. The argument is BYU is an extension of the church. It's supplemented by tithing dollars, and therefore it makes sense. It's justified to reaffirm that orthodoxy. And they have been cheered on by many onlookers, especially in a cultural moment in which many believe that universities have gone woke or are conforming to secular society. So going beyond these practices, I think it's important to dig into the ideology behind these moves, as well as explain the broader cultural current from which they come. To understand the broader context, I think it might be useful to introduce one of my favorite books in Mormon studies that examines these tensions of cultural relationship to the broader world. Armin Moss, a very well-established sociologist of religion, wrote the book Angel and the Beehive, in which he argued that Mormonism is in constant struggle between an assimilation impulse to become seen as more American and a retrenchment impulse to try to reaffirm their exceptionalism and divide themselves from the wicked world. And Gilbert's vision largely fits into this larger retrenchment trajectory that we see throughout Mormonism, especially in the 20th century, including at BYU. I've written an article for the Salt Lake Tribune a few years ago about how J. Reuben Clark's famous charted course address from 1938 is really the blue book that Clark Gilbert is still drawing from now, so it's very much embedded within the Mormon tradition. I could also point out how Ernest Wilkinson, who was president of BYU in the 1950s and 1960s, established a surveillance system of faculty and students that is very similar to Gilbert's new pledges to make sure that the university aligns with church standards. But to dig into Clark Gilbert especially, I want to do a deep dive, play professor here, on one of his most influential texts along these lines. Less than a year after becoming Commissioner of Education, he delivered an address titled "Dare to be Different: Preserving the Distinctive Light of Religious Universities," which in many ways set out his agenda, his vision for not just BYU, but religious universities across the nation. Let's start with his opening remarks. As a young professor at Harvard University, I had occasion to visit Memorial Church for personal prayer or meditation. It seemed like a solemn sanctuary in an apt secular learning environment. As I walked out the steps of the chapel, I stared across the courtyard to the wide imposing columns, creating the bulwark entrance to Widener Library. It was as if I was staring from the Temple of Faith to the Hall of Reason. These two ideals seemed to be facing off in a conflict that, at least in this formidable secular environment, would almost certainly end for many with the victory of reason. A few things I want to highlight here. While it's true that Harvard had the religious origins, right, it was seen as a divinity school, it's not like they left all those principles behind. Harvard still has the chapel on campus that Clark Gilbert had attended. They still had a divinity school. They still employ pastors. They don't see faith and learning in conflict, as Gilbert seems to imply. Which means that what we are seeing in Gilbert's narrative there has a specific agenda or goal. It's what scholars call a declension narrative, that there used to be some divine past in which everything was established according to God's law, and that we've kind of slid far toward what he sees as the big enemy of secularism. And secularism comes up quite a bit in Gilbert's remarks in general, but especially in this specific address. Here's another quote. "But once the spiritual learning was decoupled from secular inquiry, the path to secularization has been set." Note this declension framework, that there was a divine origin, but it has since been lost due to the danger of secularism. That is a matter of orientation and allegiance. Here's one more quote along those lines. "Despite these important social and academic contributions," talking about these secular universities, "mounting secular pressures threaten to limit religious universities' differentiating role in American higher education." In other words, these religious schools are under threat, and we need to reaffirm their core identities due to the onslaught of secular education. And in no place is this more crucial in his vision, according to his own words, than the hiring practices of BYU. Remember, I talked about those loyalty pledges done by new hires and existing faculty. So in response to the claim that academic disciplines may require more latitude in hiring faculty, this is what he says in the address. "In this climate, it is important for religious schools to assert the rights of their students and their communities to learn and work in a religious setting," meaning justification that we need to step in and make sure that these religious spaces remain religious spaces. Going further, "Religious mission benefits enormously at institutions that emphasize their faculty code of conduct or even their covenant commitment as part of faculty hiring and governance. Therefore, the benefits outweigh the potential costs of restricting their individual expression." Then one final quote. "But to shape internal hiring and promotion across the entire university requires leadership that goes far beyond baseline ecclesiastical standards." Basic ecclesiastical standards, in other words, are not enough. "To avoid outsourcing critical faculty decisions requires a knowledge of faculty scholarship and teaching deep inside the academic culture and administration." In other words, justifying the higher up intervention into these hiring decisions. So here we see the ideological justification for the policies I mentioned earlier. So there's a few key lessons I think we can take from this address. The idea that the wider world has lost its moral foundations, that BYU, and by extension the LDS Church, must stand unique, that there must be a streamlined message and allegiance with minimal divergence in order to keep that religious mission clear, and that the institution must be nimble enough from top-down governance in order to intervene and assure this. Now, much of these ideas are congruent with the broader culture war positions. The fear that universities have gone woke and are no longer teaching truths but have bought into progressive ideologies, the fear of secular knowledge, as you see a worry that we're no longer teaching biblical truth in the classroom, a call to return to a golden age in the past where we actually prioritize these true values, and a rejection of progressive inroads, especially on gender and sexuality. All of that is broad and also embedded within the Mormon tradition. But I also, to kind of tie things back to the beginning, see these as the culmination of many of the disruption school principles that he and others like Clayton Christensen, Kim Clark, Henry Eyring had been involved with at Harvard Business School. That the public interests, those patronages, take priority over individual freedom, that the broader system should be prioritized over the individual human, that institutional growth is justified even if it means curtailing personal expression, and that there must be fidelity to the public interest or the shareholders. In other words, I think this vision that Clark Gilbert is presenting, and I hope I provided a fair overview, fits into the long history of Mormon retrenchment. It reflects the broader cultural issues on fears of modern secular universities. And it is also a result of his own theories of business innovation and disruption. Of course, the most important stakeholder or shareholder, the definer of the public interest in this case, is Dallin H. Oaks, who obviously appreciated this approach and vision from Clark Gilbert and saw it as crucial for the Quorum of the 12. Notably, just a couple weeks ago when he spoke at a BYU devotional, he said, quote, "Never let your secular learning limit your horizons," a sentiment that is probably quite similar to what Clark Gilbert has been teaching. So now Clark Gilbert is in a position of authority for the rest of his life. There's possibility he might soften or shift his position under the weight of the mantle of the calling. We have examples of this in the past in which apostolic labor has been known to transform people. But I think right now we see how he envisions transforming those important ideas which he sees as crucial to the LDS tradition into this new position of authority. In his interview with Peggy Fletcher Stack of the Salt Lake Tribune last week, he was asked about the reputation he had developed at BYU, and this was his response that I think is quite revealing. "I'm not the arbiter of orthodoxy. It's really the doctrine of the church and the safety in being grounded in those teachings. One of the things I've always tried to do is point people to the living prophet and the prophet's teachings. When I taught the words of President Russell Nelson, I would have that in my responsibilities as Commissioner of Education and in my teachings as a general authority. When he passed away in September, I had to pivot and turn to a new prophet and teach what the Lord was giving him." Now, obviously, this is him trying to push back and challenge or nuance the reputation that he likely sees as unfair in the public record. But I also want to note that while he's insisting he's not the arbiter of authority, he's also not denying that he's the enforcer of it either. And further, he is defining his standard of orthodoxy here as allegiance to the current president, rather than, the eternal truth or corpus of doctrines, which seems to indicate institutional loyalty at the heart of his definition of orthodoxy. So it'll be interesting, I think, to understand how things develop from here and how he employs this background to his new position as apostle. I hope this video is seen as fair and an overview of Gilbert's ideas and teachings, so much so that I hope that he and his supporters would also see it as fair. But in general, I hope this demonstrates, again, why history has never been relevant than it is the present, because it gives us context to know that these types of ideas don't come out of anywhere, that they both have a long history within the Mormon tradition, as well as they have currency in our current cultural moment, and we need to keep these things in mind. I hope you found this video useful. If so, hit the like button and share with others. Become a subscriber to this channel, and if you want to give back, you can become a member too. History has never been more relevant, even if it can be difficult, but I'm glad to have these conversations with all of you on this channel.